Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our association leadership series. We're very excited to have a very relevant and timely topic today. My name is James Donnelly, founder and chairman of the CASA Group, and we have a surprise expert this month. Donna Berger has been doing this series with me for a couple of years, and she's on vacation this week. So we have the big cheese over at Becker, Ken Director. Ken is the chair of the Community Association practice at Becker and also former chair of the Florida Bar Committee for board certification. So Ken, first of all, thank you and welcome.
Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure to be here.
I love I was going to say I love the background, but I think that those are real guitars behind you.
They most certainly are.
Well, today we're going to talk about annual meetings, elections, and the benefits of using technology for mailing and voting. And the reason we picked this topic, frankly, was at the end of each of our webinars, we ask you, what do you want us to talk about next? And this was the most commonly asked a topic, and Ken, probably good timing. I mean, this is kind of annual meeting election season.
It is, and this is the peak of it.
Yeah, so this will be great, and I want to remind everybody we're gonna try and move back and forth between condominium and HOA and a little bit of co-op. It gets a little difficult because some of the laws are different, but we'll do our best there. The format, you've submitted a bunch of great questions, which I put on my notes here, but we really do welcome the online Q&A live. It helps me kind of shape my questions for Ken. And you can always go to email info@casagroup.com if there's anything beyond the scope of this webinar you need some information on. And I want to make sure everybody knows Ken is generous enough to offer his time today, but it's really a conversation and not legal advice. And if you need to go to your own attorney for legal advice on this topic. Today, we're the agenda's on the board there. I just want to make a couple comments on some bills moving through Tallahassee that I think are bad for our industry and we need your help on. Then we're going to jump right into our main topic, and then the Q&A. If we have time left, we'll hit more of the online questions, but normally I can pick them up along the way. And Ken, normally we fill up the whole time slot.
Oh, so I'm a caller. We won't have any problem.
Yes. We did not want to do a legislative update. I think next month we're going to know a lot more about what's actually going to happen in Tallahassee. But there are two bills, HB 1203. It's commonly referred to as the HOA bill. It is a really bad bill. It makes it very difficult for us to run our associations in terms of collecting assessments, enforcing our covenants. And really, it's the product of maybe, I don't know how many, but 5 or 10 bad actor boards out of the 50,000 in our state. And this is absolutely a solution looking for a problem. That's HB 1203. And the other one is HB 979. The legislature is trying to eliminate and restrict how associations provide what are called estoppels and the fees related to that. They're effectively trying to take a transactional cost, and estoppel is done when someone sells their home, and make it a cost to all homeowners. And so my ask and why I bring them up is I think for the benefit of our industry and for your association, it would be helpful for everyone on this webinar to email their legislator in the House, their state representative, and you could just Google that. It's not hard to find. And their email addresses are right on the state website, and ask them to vote no on these two bills, HB 979 and HB 1203. So, Ken, I know do you have any comments on that before we move on? I just wanted to take advantage of having a big audience today to get more pressure on these legislators to stop bad legislation.
James, I believe you said all that needs to be said. It is unfortunate that there are bills out there. Sometimes they are omnibus bills, which is a fancy way of saying they're big bills. And sometimes they include a lot of good things, but sometimes they also include just a couple really bad things. And it's unfortunate But it poisons the public and the industry against the entire bill. It's an unfortunate reality of the legislative process.
Yeah, and really the only way we get no's out of legislators is to let them know their constituency doesn't like the bill. So, okay, enough on that. Ken, I really wanted to start the discussion on annual meetings to put in context what meetings associations have, as annual meetings aren't the only ones they have. So maybe just kind of give us a high level, what are the types of meetings that our boards have or should have? Let's start there. And
meetings fall into three categories. Number one, there are membership meetings. And in membership meetings, there are two types. The annual meeting, which everyone is aware of, and the annual meeting is also the time when you conduct your election. Then there are special meetings, which are for everything else the owners vote on: amendments to the documents, the funding of reserves, the reduction of financial reporting requirements, anything else that your documents require the members to vote on. So those are the two types of membership meetings. Board meetings are the most prevalent meetings because there are only a few things that the members vote on. The board votes on virtually everything else. And board meetings have their own procedural requirements, which we can get into a little bit. But then the third type of meeting is committee meeting. And a committee meeting is, as the name expresses, a meeting of a group of people that have been appointed typically either by the president or the board to serve on a committee and serve a particular purpose. Committee meetings can be subject to the same requirements applicable to board meetings, or they can be exempt if your bylaws exempt them. But there are certain types of committee meetings that always have to be noticed and open like board meetings. For condos, that's a meeting of a committee that is involved in developing the budget, or a committee that is vested with the authority to make final decisions. For HOAs, that also applies to co-ops, by the way. For HOAs, a committee that has a final authority to approve the expenditure of association funds, and a committee that makes decisions regarding architectural control issues in an HOA must have its meetings noticed and open. So those are the three types of committees, and it's important for everyone listening that the first question you should ask yourselves when you're embarking on a major project is who needs to approve it, because that will tell you what type of meeting or meetings you need to have.
excellent. Okay, and then that kind of the reason I wanted to go through that is we're talking today about annual meetings, but
Yeah.
I think it's important to put those meetings in context. And those are membership meetings, and often coincide with an election. Okay, so when we were talking earlier, you said the annual meeting and an election are two separate things. Maybe just spend some time for our audience to tell us how they're different.
In a condo and a co-op, because HOAs are still kind of the wild, wild west with regard to their annual meetings and elections. In a condo or a co-op, it became obvious to the legislature, I don't know, maybe 15, 20, 25 years ago, that boards were being perpetuated in office because they just couldn't get a quorum to participate at the annual meeting. So the legislature said, for the purpose of conducting election, you only need 20% of your population to participate and cast a ballot. So what that means is that you could have an election because 20% would participate and cast a ballot, but not have an annual meeting because A, you don't have anything else on the agenda, or B, you can't achieve quorum to actually convene an annual meeting. So they are two distinct events, but they have been over the years kind of blended together. But everybody listening needs to understand that one can occur without the other, because you could have an election without an annual meeting, but you also may have an annual meeting but not have enough candidates to have an election. So you could have an annual meeting without an election. You have to remember, for condos and co-ops, the nomination process ends 40 days before the meeting. So you know 40 days ahead of time whether or not you have enough candidates to even have an election. And sometimes after that deadline, one or more candidates may decide, this isn't for me, and drop out. So the point that we're trying to make, James and I are trying to make, is that you can have an election without an annual meeting, and you can have an annual meeting without an election.
Excellent. Kara's just reminded me, I haven't put up my poll questions here, Ken. So Andres, will you put up poll question 1? We always like to know who our audience is in terms of condos and co-ops and HOAs, and that may, Ken, help you shape some of your answers. So thank you, Kara. All right. So the next question I have for you, Ken, is what do we as board members look for our authority to hold these meetings? Is it statutory? Is it governing document driven? What guides us in terms of how we notice and conduct these meetings? And I'm now talking about annual meetings.
Well, you know, I feel like the customer at the restaurant when the waitress says, "Do you want ketchup or mustard?" and you say yes. The answer is yes. The guidelines for calling meetings are both statutory and document driven, typically bylaw driven. I said earlier that there is an annual meeting and a special meeting for membership meetings. The bylaws will prescribe who can call special meetings. Typically, it's the president, a certain number of board members, and a certain percentage of the membership can compel the board to call a special meeting of the members. For board meetings, the president can always call a board meeting, and most documents address, again, in the bylaws, who else can compel the board to call a special meeting. For condos and co-ops, 20% of the owners can petition the board and force the board to call a meeting of the board. Again, a meeting of the board within 60 days of receipt of the petition. That doesn't mean the board has to do what the owners want them to do with regard to that agenda item, but they have to at least bring it up on an agenda. I've always believed that the board should operate transparently. And I'm a big believer in facilitating unit owner participation. So when the owners want to discuss something, I think should at least consider putting it on the agenda, especially if enough owners feel strongly enough about it. If 20% of the owners want the board to consider something, at least open it for discussion. I think, first of all, I think they're entitled to, but the law says they are entitled to have it put on the agenda.
And there were 2 words in our talk yesterday that you repeated a lot. One was participation, and the other was transparency. And I think those are great things to consider as we decide how we're going to move forward in our associations for having our meetings and our communications.
Okay, Ken, if I may, I've been doing this, Gene, for 40 years. And the communities that always have the most animosity, the most incivility, are communities where the owners perceive, rightly or wrongly, they perceive that the board is not operating transparently and is not facilitating unit owner participation. There are some perceptions you can't fight. They're just going to be there no matter what. But I encourage the boards to communicate with the owners, send out a once or twice a month newsletter, especially if there are major projects going on. Because if you don't fill that information vacuum, someone else will. And that'll create even more problems for you.
And with our electronic communication ability and websites, there's no excuse to not over communicate today.
And it's almost guaranteed that there will be negative campaigns that you don't necessarily need to respond to, but you need to fill the vacuum so that there's no room for them to dispel, or pardon me, to spread misinformation, because it's going to happen otherwise.
Can you see the results there?
Yes, I can.
And it looks like we're 50-50. Andres, you can take that down. That's great to know. And I'd love to see our very equally represented audience. So, all right. We often get asked who should attend our annual meetings. Obviously, the board, the owners, the manager. What about attorney? What about other professionals that could or should attend an annual meeting? What are your thoughts?
Well, let's talk first about what it means to, quotes, attend. With the advent of technology, and COVID was very good for the for Zoom and other telecommunication providers, and we've all come to rely on it as we are doing right now. It would be much more difficult for us to sit in a room with a couple hundred people than it is for us to organize it this way and invite you just to log in. And I think people have become accustomed to this. Attend, though, if you have online voting, you count toward a quorum if you exercise your right to vote online. Number two, with Zoom, a board can adopt a resolution to allow the people who attend by Zoom to count toward a quorum and to vote. Now, voting in a condo or co-op in the election, you can't do because there's a formulaic way to vote. In HOAs, it may be more feasible, but there's just no excuse with the technology not to make membership attendance more convenient for the members and facilitate participation. And I'm sure there are a lot of people listening who are thinking, gee, I wish we could vote on this alteration to improve this part of our property, or gee, I wish we could vote on these amendments to improve our operations, but we can just never get enough participation. And you now have the opportunity through technology and the changes in the law to embrace the use of technology. You now have the opportunity to facilitate unit owner participation. And I think, for one, I think it's a good thing. I think if you facilitate unit owner participation, you make it harder for people to complain that you're not operating transparently.
Yeah, I think that one of the questions that came up was, does Zoom participation count towards a quorum? Because one of the problems we've always had was getting quorums, and when people can Zoom in, that certainly helps you achieve that quorum. So I'm glad you addressed that issue.
The answer is it can if you follow the proper steps.
Yeah. Okay, I want to put up poll question 2, Ken, to give you an idea of what % of our communities have received consent to use electronic communications. Andres, put up poll 2 while we continue this conversation.
One of the questions I always ask my clients, James, is, and we're always meeting on Zoom. So I'm saying, what percentage of your owners, what percentage of them don't have email, don't go online? And the percentage, maybe 10 years ago it was here, and it's shrinking down literally to nothing. And I asked them then, what percentage of your owners would prefer to get their notices by email rather than waiting for the US Postal Service to make a delivery? Because I've seen so many instances when people who live out of state or even out of the country can't get notices in time to even get their vote back. Sometimes people receive the notice after the meeting has occurred. So I'm a big believer in using technology to facilitate participation. And the first way to do that is to get owners to consent to receive all notices from the association by email.
What's interesting, I'm kind of having to interpret the data. Can you share the results there, Andres? It looks like over 50% of our communities are doing it that way. And I'll bet it could be even north of that because there's a big, I don't know, percentage there, but that would look very different 5 or 6 years ago. So that's encouraging.
It is. I often say to my clients, I say, look, if you have 100 units, especially for bigger communities, 100, 200, 1,000, if 70 or 80% of your owners consent to receive notice by email, how much time and money does it save you every time you have to do a mailing to your entire community? You drag a PDF to a preset email group, you hit send. And for the rest of the owners, if they want to receive it by regular mail, God bless them.
On annual meetings, we talked about the election component, but what other things would be on an agenda at an annual meeting?
Well, for example, you may be voting on amendments to your governing documents. You may be voting, depending upon the timing of your annual meeting, on the waiver of reserves. And for those who are fearful that you're never going to be able to waive reserves again, you will lose the right to vote to waive the structural integrity reserve component of reserves. The roof, the structure, the plumbing, the electrical, those are the types of things that are listed in the statute that for which reserves will be required to be funded. Now, there may be some consideration of allowing alternatives to full funding. The legislature is wrestling with that, but I don't know if or when that kind of relief will be given. Interestingly, the only exception from full funding of reserves was given to a multi-condo association that operates more than 25 condos. And ironically, that applies to exactly one condominium in the entire state of Florida. Somebody had a good connection.
Evidently.
But there are other reserves that you will still be able to consider waiving, which are not structural. Some of the furnishings, the pool furniture, the pool deck. So the waiver of reserves is diminished, but it's not gone. You can also, if you're doing the vote before the end of the fiscal year, you might be voting on the waiver or reduction of your financial reporting requirements. You may be voting on alterations to your property. You may be contemplating, adding a putting green or adding a porte cochere for people to drop off, their people out of their cars so they don't have to be in the rain. There are any number of things that could be on the agenda. But there are, as I said earlier, James, a limited number of components or items that actually require a membership vote.
Interesting. We had a couple of questions come in. I just wanted to do some quick ones for you. Does the consent for email receipt apply to HOAs and condos and co-ops? All of them? The law supports that consent?
All three can have their owner's consent to receive notice by email, and frankly should encourage it because it's better for the owners and it's better for the association.
What recourse do owners have if the association decided unilaterally not to hold an annual election altogether as required by our bylaws?
That answer, I'm going to give a lawyerly answer. I don't like doing this, but it depends because the board doesn't just decide not to have an election. There's usually a reason. And sometimes the reason is that there aren't enough candidates. That's typically the reason. But if your board is not operating in a way that is responsive to its obligations under the statute, then initiate a recall. Ultimately,
Yes.
and I know this sounds a little harsh, but you get the government you deserve, and that includes, at your community association. If you're unhappy with the board, it is one thing to complain, but it's also another thing to say, I'm willing to step up and run and serve.
You and I had a conversation yesterday, Ken, about term limits. They were put in place in 17 or 18, and they were 8 years, and we're coming up against that. And I was interested in the answer you gave. Term limits.
We've had term limits. We've always had them. They're called elections.
Yeah, that's what I wanted you to say.
Yep. Actually, I have to give attribution. That was one of Gary Polyakoff's pet phrases.
God bless him. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. So now we're allowed to do electronic communications if we have consent. We're allowed to use Zoom. Thank you, COVID, for that. Zoom says thank you too.
That they serve the shareholders.
Yeah. Can we run an only Zoom meeting?
In my opinion, no. In my opinion, the owners have the right to attend meetings, and I don't believe it is appropriate to require them to have internet access to be able to exercise the right to attend the meeting. I think you don't have to offer Zoom. I don't know why you wouldn't, but there are some boards that, just the noise becomes deafening when they have too many people at the meeting. But I do not believe it is proper to require people to attend only by Zoom. You have the right to attend the meeting and participate in the agenda, and I don't believe you can condition that right on being able to log in by Zoom.
Can owners make motions at annual meetings?
Well, only on the agenda items or at special meetings of the members. You have to remember a meeting, whether it's a board meeting or a membership meeting, it's supposed to have an agenda. And if you don't have an agenda, you're not complying with the statute. You're also relinquishing your ability to control what is discussed at the meeting. And I'm not saying that because I want the board to be exercising too much control. I'm saying that because as an owner in the community, I want to know what's going to be discussed at that meeting, because there may be something that interests me that may compel me to want to attend, whether in person or by Zoom. And if the board allows that subject to be discussed, even though it's not on the agenda, now I'm going to have a problem with it, because I would say, wait a second, you discussed this, you voted on it, it wasn't on the agenda. I have an opinion on it. So having an agenda allows you to run a structured, organized meeting. And if it's a board meeting, the motions are made by the board members. If it's a membership meeting, any member can make a motion to dispense with the reading of the minutes, to call the question on an amendment or an alteration that's being voted on. At membership meetings, annual meetings in particular, I like to have the members vote to close the polls so they can start counting ballots. So that way, if someone comes in late, we can tell them the membership closed out the voting, not the board, not the lawyer, not the manager. The motions are made at membership meetings by the members. Now, the board members are members. There's a common misconception that, for example, the motion to dispense with the reading of the minutes is made, seconded, and voted on by just the board. At a membership meeting, the board does not vote on anything except as members. Similarly, at a board meeting, the membership doesn't vote on anything except to the extent there are members on the board. And that the two shall never coalesce.
So a couple, I'm just reading questions and trying to get some clarity on a couple items. If we don't have as many nominations as positions, there's no election?
In a condo or a co-op, that is correct. In an HOA, if the documents don't allow some self-nomination process in advance of the meeting, you are required to allow nominations from the floor. Now, most people don't know that they have the right to nominate themselves from the floor. And to the extent that you have a nominating committee or some other way that people get nominated by petition ahead of time, you're going to send out a proxy or a ballot because the HOA statute doesn't have anywhere near the same level of formalities that the condo and co-op statutes do for elections. So someone nominating themselves from the floor, quite frankly, has very little chance of getting elected unless they show up with, dozens or a couple hundred proxies.
We have some questions about the privacy and the reluctance to provide email addresses. And if we go back to our last poll where it said only half the people are using electronic consent, maybe it's this privacy issue. So my question to you, Ken, is how exposed is my email address if I provide it to the association and consent to electronic communications?
Email addresses are considered personal identifying information. And there are a lot of people who provide their email address as an emergency contact. But if you do not consent to allow your email address to be used for official notices, your email address is not susceptible to another unit owner's records inspection request. Now, some communities publish a directory and that cow's out of the barn. But I have very little concern about my email address being public because I'm going to get the junk mail. I'm going to get the unsolicited, rants about the board or about politics or about, who knows what. It's just as easy for me to hit delete and block as it is for me to throw some unwanted correspondence in the garbage. And if it means that I get information from the association faster than the mail can get it to me, that's a trade-off I'm willing to make. But that's everybody's personal choice.
I have 3 emails: my business email, my personal email, and then the email I give everybody else if you're transacting or anything that's going to get blitzed. So okay, good. There's a couple questions on meet the candidates a process or nights or pre-election getting to know who's running. Is this mandatory, A, and B, is it a good idea?
No, it is not mandatory. And whether it's a good idea is debatable. The reflexive reaction to that is giving the candidates a forum in which to discuss their platform and have the owners ask them questions. We would all think that's a good thing, unless it's turned into the kind of politicking that we've seen in some condos and even in our country lately. Having 2 candidates come to blows in front of the owners is not a good thing. Having people in the audience literally attack, whether it be verbally or physically, the candidates, that's not a good thing. Having the candidates attacking each other verbally, it just doesn't reflect well on the community. And it creates a level of toxicity that filters and permeates down through the community. So you have to have people who are willing to be civil and professional and polite and conduct themselves in a way that reflects well on the community. I realize that's, some of you are saying, yeah, good luck with that. The number of communities I've had that have adopted a civility code for board members, for committee members, even for other members of the community, because you have people, chasing around vendors, you have people, abusing each other and abusing staff. I can't imagine there's anybody out there who thinks that's good for their community. I certainly don't.
Agree. Who sets the agenda for the annual meeting?
The agenda for membership meetings is typically set out in a portion of the bylaws entitled Order of Business. And the bylaws prescribe the agenda for the annual meeting. And it's typically, you call the meeting to order, you verify notice, you verify a quorum, you conduct your election, you conduct old business, you conduct new business. I want to comment on new business or good and welfare. New business or good and welfare are not, I repeat, are not an opportunity for anybody to raise anything for discussion. Remember what I said a few minutes ago about the importance of having an agenda and staying on the agenda. I've always advised my clients that new business or good and welfare is an opportunity for people to raise items for consideration for inclusion on a future agenda, not for full discussion. Because if I'm an owner and it's brought up and it wasn't on the agenda, I want to participate in that discussion. I don't want it to occur without me. And that's why the legislature requires an agenda and specifically says for special members meetings, the only things that can be addressed are those items on the agenda.
Can a non-owner attend an annual meeting or a membership meeting?
Technically, you could argue that the answer is no. Practically speaking, it happens everywhere. For example, you may have a couple where she owns the unit and he doesn't. Are you going to tell him he can't attend? You could, but you better do that for every single unit where there's only one of the two people on title. The board can always invite people to attend. Renters do not have the right to attend. Guests do not have the right to attend. And frankly, I don't believe owners have the right to bring their lawyers with them to meetings. In the past, I have allowed it as long as it has been a civil discourse. But when somebody is bringing their lawyer to intimidate the board or to intimidate another owner, they got no right to do that. And if I'm counsel for the association, they've got no right to speak to my client. So I have problems with that. We wouldn't be having this discussion, James, if we could rely on everybody to be civil and professional. But the problem is we can't. There are people who choose to exert their leverage in a disagreement by simply being disagreeable, as opposed to simply discussing and debating the facts and the law and the policy. It has become very difficult to have effective meetings in an era where incivility is at an all-time high. And it's frankly distressing to the professionals who try to assist these communities by moving them forward. Sorry, I didn't mean to sermonize there, but it's an issue that troubles me.
It was interesting. We actually noticed an uptick in bad behavior, if I can call it that, in COVID, and maybe it was just the stress that we're all living under. Okay, so what about organizational meeting? Is that part of the annual meeting as a part of the election? When does that happen?
The annual meeting is a membership meeting. The organizational meeting is a board meeting. So it is a separate meeting. In most communities, the vast majority of communities, the organizational meeting, which by the way is a noticed open board meeting. It happens to be the only time though that the board can vote on something by a secret ballot. If they're going to vote on officers, they can pass out little slips of paper and say, I vote for James or I vote for Earl or what have you. But the organizational meeting generally is required to occur within 10 days of the annual meeting. I don't recommend waiting on the organizational meeting because an organization needs a president, a vice president, a treasurer, a secretary. If you're going to go 10 days like a headless horseman, you're going to function like a headless horseman. So I think it's important to have an organizational meeting, if not immediately after the annual meeting adjourns, as quickly as possible.
What about minutes of membership and annual meetings. Are they approved like 1 year later or at the next membership meeting? How does one deal with that?
Minutes of meetings at whatever level are typically part of the agenda and are approved at the next meeting of that body. So the next time you have a membership meeting, one of these standard order of business items, I neglected to mention it before when I started to talk about them. One of them is the approval of the minutes of the last meeting. And the same applies to board meetings.
Well,
Now,
that's
just a quick comment, if I may, James. Minutes are kind of an art. There will be people who will send a lengthy diatribe and say, I want this included in the minutes. They have no right to. People say, I'm going to give a 2-minute speech now and I want it transcribed verbatim into the minutes. They don't have the right to. The minutes are required to reflect who attends, and they are required to reflect what motions were made, who made them, who seconded them, and how each board member voted. Now, I'm not.
And that's it.
I'm not.
And that's it.
That's what's required. I'm not suggesting you need to be that bare bones, but I'm also not suggesting that your minutes should be 10 pages long. I'm also not suggesting your meetings should be 4 hours long. But that's an issue, and we can get to that, James, if you have it on your list of questions as to how the board controls a meeting.
I'm going to get there. I want to get to electronic voting here because I know it was a big interest from our audience.
Okay.
So I believe in 2015, actually, let me look at my poll questions here.
That sounds about
can you
right.
put up,
Yeah.
what's that?
That sounds about
I'll
right. When you're speculating that online voting went into effect. I think that's about
2015, right. Yeah. Yep. Okay. Let's put up question 3. Yeah, there we go. And then right away, we're going to put up question 4 because it's on electronic voting. But just jumping in here. So we do have statutory support for having electronic voting in Florida now. HOA, condo, co-op?
All 3, yes.
Okay. But that doesn't mean we can just go do it. What do we have to do as an individual association to enable ourselves to use an electronic platform?
There's a separate statute in each of the separate section, I should say, in each of the 3 statutes, the condo, the co-op, and the HOA statute, that addresses online voting. And I think they're identical. And they lay out the procedure for what is required of the online voting platform in terms of security and the ability of the owner to verify that their actions are being read by the platform, and that certain votes, like in a condo or co-op, their vote for the board is confidential. But the process, which is of most interest to the people listening to this discussion, is the board is required to notice a board meeting with 14 days notice posted and mailed. So it's with the same formality as a budget meeting or a special assessment meeting or a rule at which you adopt, a meeting at which you adopt rules regulating the use of the units. At that meeting, the board adopts a resolution that implements online voting, but that's the easy part. The hard part is going out and getting people to sign an individual consent to use online voting. Now, I want to emphasize the fact that you consent to online voting doesn't mean the board, A, has to use it every time you have a vote, or B, that as an owner, I have to vote online, I can't submit a proxy, or I can't go to the meeting and submit a ballot and participate in the discussion. It is simply a way of giving owners another way to participate and vote. It is not, it doesn't lock you in.
So, by the way, the Zoom participation was 85% of our associations are allowing Zooms. And now I'm asking the one on the apps. So we'll wait till that result comes in. But so I have.
And I add a comment, pardon the interruption, but if that many of you are using Zoom, you should also consider the value of adopting a resolution to allow people who want to participate by Zoom in membership meetings to count toward a quorum, because it will help you get to critical mass so you can actually take votes. So
that's a really important
using Zoom is step one. Step 2 is allowing it to become a way for your meetings to be effective and get things done.
I think that's really important. And one of the things I'd have lower down, because I'm not sure we'll get to it, is just the whole idea of a lot of us are operating our associations with documents that were written 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago.
Yeah.
And it's amazing if we take over, you know, a community, often self-managed because they haven't necessarily had a professional management company. And they've just kind of operated well. I mean, they're very well run, but their documents don't reflect today's reality. So one of our recommendations, Don and I have been preaching this for the last couple of years, is not on this just specific point, but if you haven't re-looked at your documents in the last 10 years, you probably should, and bring them up to, including the utilization of Zoom for quorums, which would be fantastic.
Well, you also have to remember, in the 70s, developers stopped using language in their condo documents that incorporated future amendments to the statute, because the developers did not want specific practices like recreational facilities leases to be subject to new regulation and new restrictions. So what happens is there's always a question if your documents don't include this language that says we're subject to the statute as it may be amended from time to time. Those are the magic words. Not as amended or as of this date, but as it may be amended from time to time. Then somebody can always argue that some of these changes are not applicable and not available to you. Typically, procedural changes, and I don't want to get into a whole constitutional analysis here, but typically procedural changes apply no matter what. Some substantive changes where the legislature thinks it's important enough to have it apply to everybody can apply no matter what, like the insurance amendments to the Condo Act. But it is important that your documents allow for the Condo Act to apply, and I'm a believer that the act should apply as it is amended from time to time. And if you don't want to do that, at the very least, not every 10 years, but every couple of years, you should consult with your counsel as to what amendments have occurred that you really should incorporate into your documents. For example, in all the documents I write, James, it says you can vote in person, by proxy, or by any other lawful means. And that way I know there's no challenge to people voting online or voting by Zoom.
Okay. So one thing I want to clarify is a owner can demand a snail mail process. But if, and don't think we've ever had this happen, 100% of people consent to electronic, you don't have to do a snail mail. That's a question.
That is correct. An owner can always revoke consent to receive notice by email, but if you can get 100% consent, I think that's great. You know, one of the interesting questions I've had the last couple of days, which is worth mentioning, is can we do it by hand delivery? And one of the questions involved a building that had like little mail slots for each unit. And I said, I don't think that is sufficient hand delivery. I think you need to have some way of verifying that the hand delivery actually resulted in delivery to the hand of the owner. Hand delivery, unless you're going to walk door to door and check off who was there to accept it, or unless you're going to actually use hand delivery, which is ungodly expensive, email is much better. It's much less labor intensive for the association.
Okay, I just wanted to, that's going to be our last poll question, but I wanted you to see, Ken, we got about 26% are using electronic formats right now, 68 not, and 6 don't know. So you can take that down, Andre. So this is interesting to me is, you know, why aren't more communities using electronic? You know, we seem to be in that age. Maybe just give us your thoughts on why we aren't using that as much as one would expect us to.
I think all of the, how shall I describe this? The malevolent uses of technology and social media have made people skeptical of anything that they put on their computer screen or send by their computer screen. People who've had identity theft. I mean, I realize there is a lot of concern in this country about outside agencies wanting to influence elections. I'm not sure how much interest there is in hiring a hacker to influence the election in your community. And I have always felt that an online vote, frankly, is more secure than a paper ballot that could get lost in the mail or can get tossed in a trash can by somebody who doesn't want your vote to be counted. So I understand that there is skepticism out there, and I don't fault anybody for having some. I've had identity theft occur to me a couple times, and I still use credit cards, but I I would suggest that people figure out a way to get over it and use it. And people in the community who don't want to do online voting, they don't have to consent to it. But I think I think we are getting to the point where we are at a generational shift. You have people in the communities in their 80s, their 90s, or even higher, who are just averse to technology, and they're not comfortable with it. They don't trust it. They don't want to use it. But I think we're at a point in our evolution as a species where virtually everyone has spent some time on a computer or on the internet, and there is some comfort level with it. And if it facilitates unit owner participation and it facilitates association operations and it saves you time and money, I don't know why you wouldn't at least offer it. My 2 cents.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's good. So once we get consent from an owner, once we've done our resolutions, we've chosen a application. And by the way, I know Becker has one called Becker Ballot, and there's 4 or 5 others that we use as well. And my only comment on that, because you can easily go find them on the internet, and our clients were happy to recommend some, but there are some out there that aren't compliant with Florida law. So that's my only caution, because there are some very strict requirements on privacy and access and whatnot in the Florida statute. So that's my only warning. But so now I've got consent of an owner. Do I need to get consent for the next annual meeting?
No, once you get consent, it's good till it's revoked.
Yeah. And the other thing I wanted to highlight is once you get on an electronic platform, it's not just for elections. It can be used for surveys. It can be used for
Other votes.
membership, other votes.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to highlight that it's not just elections. It has more utility than that. So the other thing I wanted to talk about is we've had trouble getting forums in certain communities. We have an increasing number of foreign owners. We have an increasing number of snowbirds. It seems to me this electronic format is really opening up participation in these votes. And so I think it should be encouraged. Is there any rules about participating not in Florida or not in the US in these electronic voting processes?
No, you can, as long as you can log on to the internet, you can use an online voting platform that allows you to vote from anywhere. I think, and as far as the electronic notice is concerned, you can receive notices from the association anywhere in the world where you have an internet connection. There's no geographical boundary. Same thing for Zoom participation, James. I mean, you can participate by Zoom anywhere you can get onto a Zoom call.
Yeah. What's in terms of a process? No, sorry, there was a question about language. Are there any requirements in Florida to offer voting or surveying in any language other than English?
I don't recall a specific requirement. I mean, interestingly, for summonses, they're required to be, I believe, in Spanish and French and English. You have to react. Listen, if we're talking about transparency and inclusion and facilitating unit owner participation, if you have a substantial population that speaks only Spanish, then do what it takes to make sure that they get communications in a language they can read. If you have a tremendous part of your population that speaks only Russian or French, have the communications translated into their language so they can participate. There are requirements under the fair housing laws for people who are deaf or hard of hearing that you use a sign language person at meetings so that they can participate in the discussion. I'm not aware of any specific requirement that the notices that are sent out be multilingual. But I think you need to do that and make that decision on a case-by-case basis based upon your constituency.
Interesting. A question came in that I'm not sure we answered specifically. Ken, we understand we need to get consent, and we understand we need to do a resolution to enable us to do electronic platform. Do we need to amend our documents to allow us to do that?
I don't believe you need to, but if you're going to update your documents, you certainly should update them to clearly allow voting by any legal means. Because if your documents are more than 10 years old, 20 years old, 30 years old, 50 years old, they say the owners can vote in person or by proxy.
Okay, so a good idea, but not necessarily a requirement. So now I've done my vote electronically. I did it, 3 weeks before, and I changed my mind. Can I change my vote?
Not if it's the election of the board in a condo or a co-op. The law has been very clear for a couple decades that in a condo or a co-op, and I emphasize this is not applicable to HOAs yet, but in condos and co-ops, the Florida Administrative Code is very clear that once your ballot is received by the association, it cannot be revoked, rescinded, or changed. So somebody out there is thinking, well, what if somebody votes online and then forgets and shows up at the meeting and casts another vote? The first vote received is the one that counts. And that is why I advise the people who work in the offices in condos and co-ops that when paper ballots are brought in, before they are put into the ballot box, they should be stamped with the date and time. Because the vote online will have a date and time signature in the computer records. And that way you will know which vote came in first.
Interesting. So if we do get a paper and an electronic, it would be the first one in?
Correct. Well, if you think about it this way, James, if the law doesn't allow you to revoke or rescind your vote, and all you ever had to do was just cast a second vote to rescind your first vote, then the law would become meaningless. So we count the first one. But we have to be able to determine which one was the first one, which is why I'm recommending that envelopes be stamped as to when they came in. And I realize there are always, gaps. I mean, somebody may slide something under the door on a Friday night. It may not be picked up on until Monday morning, but as long as you are date stamping and time stamping those things when they come in, you'll be able to tell in the vast majority of cases which one was the first vote cast. For proxies, I want to be clear, you can always revoke a proxy by submitting a later dated proxy.
Okay, that's a good clarification. A couple more questions came in, Ken, on the use of Zoom. So we've established that you can use Zoom to establish a quorum. In a HOA, can you vote with Zoom?
In any of the three, you can vote by Zoom, except for the elections in condos and co-ops. And in HOAs, the election is conducted in accordance with the bylaws, which in most cases require a ballot. So you can vote by Zoom, but I don't think it works with elections in condos, co-ops, or HOAs. Because frankly, in elections, you want to have a record of every owner's vote, not a show of hands by a Zoom call.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the concerns about electronic voting is, how do you know what are the controls in place? And you said something interesting to me yesterday. You actually think the controls in place in electronic voting are superior to those. I mean, how do you hack the system? Whereas, anything can happen with a physical.
If I have I'm an activist in the community, and I'm trying to be diplomatic with the terms I'm using, but you all know what I'm talking about. And I know that James is voting for the people I hate. And I walk by the manager's office and he or she is away from the desk, and I see James's ballot sitting there on the desk, unopened, unaddressed, unhandled. I look around, I pick it up, I toss it in the garbage. That's a lot more low tech than having to hack into a computer system. You may also, and I don't mean to, put all that risk on the owner who's an activist. You may have a board that is looking to perpetuate itself in power. And you may find out or never find out that your ballot was never opened or counted because it was deep sixed.
Oh, that's very interesting.
Online voting is much more secure.
On that topic of security, let's say a vote is contested for whatever reason. Is anyone ever allowed to find out who I personally voted for?
Only if you put your name on your ballot. You have to remember there's a two safeguard system, a two-level security. You call it 2FA, two-factor authentication. In a condo or a co-op, and in many HOAs, the ballot has to come in an envelope that has your unit owner signature so that it can be verified that the ballot is actually being cast by the owner of that unit. Yes, I realize that nobody out there is a handwriting expert, but you do the best you can. Secondly, you are entitled to use an inner envelope that has no markings on it so that when the election ballots are counted, you verify the outer envelopes, you discard the ones that aren't signed, you open the outer envelopes, you separate the contents from the outer envelopes, and they're all put into a pile. Then and only then do you open the inner envelopes and start to count votes. And that's why it's virtually impossible to identify which ballot was yours, and unless you put your credo on the ballot or your signature.
Yeah, this has been really good. I think this is just what our audience was looking for. We only have a couple of minutes left. Is there any question I haven't asked you that I should have, or is there any kind of closing 30,000-foot thoughts on annual meetings, elections, and electronic platforms?
I would say this. As the buildings that you live in age, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, in some cases 60 years old, it is going to be increasingly important for the board to be able to communicate. And I'll say again, the communities that have the most animosity are those that don't have good lines of communication. I would say to the board members listening, it is incumbent upon you to communicate with the owners, because if you don't, you will leave a vacuum that will be filled by people who want to communicate an entirely different message to the owners. So as you have major projects come up that have to be done, if you get an engineering report that identifies life safety issues, you need to be able to communicate with your owners and make decisions as a community. I don't think it's ever been more important than now for boards to be able to effectively communicate and to use every means at their disposal to communicate with the community.
Ken, thank you so much. This is fantastic. Obviously, you're an icon in our industry, and we're so grateful you took the time to share with our audience your brilliance. So I want to thank you. Our contact information is there. This recording will be up on our website by the end of the day. And there's Ken's contact information. So we really want to thank you, the audience, for what you're doing, selflessly leading your communities. We know the pay is terrible, but we're very grateful for what you do. And so from Ken and I, we'll see you next month. And Ken, thanks again. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure, James. Thank you for having me.
Take care. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.